On my sabbatical, I led a research study and I completed a clinical internship to update my clinical skills.
I've been studying nest site selection by ospreys, and the questions I'm trying to answer is why do they use the sites they use, and why are some sites productive?
Edmund Burke is my specialty, so I did some writing on Burke and published a couple of things. Submitted an article on Milton and Sabbath. I also had a month-long Newberry Fellowship to do research at the Newberry Library.
I have a book called Contemporary Debates in Philosophy of Religion, and that book was in first edition from back in 2004, and so I started putting together the second edition.
I was doing some Medtronic research. It was the end of about a 2-year project where we were looking at tissue heart valves, and when we put our signatures on the cover page of this 92-page report, there was a great deal of satisfaction.
I did a research project. I interviewed about 20 nurses, talking to them about how the suffering of patients impacted their own spiritual well-being. And I did a qualitative study looking at those kinds of issues.
My family and I relocated to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I worked on a book called The Pietist Option, Hope for the Renewal of Christianity. And then I started work on a proposal, a spiritual but not religious biography of Charles Lindbergh.
I worked in a lab out in Cincinnati, Ohio at the Children's Hospital Medical Center. That lab is interested in how the internal organs form. We basically took a couple of genes that we thought might have a role in lung development and did some experiments to check and see if they did.
There was a groundbreaking work from the 1950s on the Greek text of the Apocalypse. Never been translated, and the sabbatical I spent my time basically bringing it to completion.
Teresa de Gaulier and I had this idea about, are all muscle tissues the same? Do they all respond the same under different conditions? And so she sacrificed a rat, and I'd taken various sections of muscle tissue. And I had these sitting in jars on my desk during the course of the last several months, probably for about a year now. And what I noticed was that over time they became lighter. And just from the overhead lights on my desk, I wonder if all tissues react with light this way. So we got some intense lights and focused it on we cut a piece of rat tissue in half. One stayed on the desk, the other was exposed to intense light. And it's amazing how light actually changed the color of the tissue. It actually dramatically lightened this tissue. Why does this happen? What fundamental mechanisms cause this? We learned quite a bit about some simple things like that, and we're hoping to get some of that published.
A lot of what I did involved searching for new authors, figuring out who I wanted to write, figuring out exactly what topics I wanted them to write on, and writing a chapter of my own.
This is Herr Joseph Schmidt, the Catholic priest who wrote the groundbreaking work on the textual history of the Apocalypse back in the 1950s. It's the high water mark, and it has been so for 60 years. And so his work is the one we translated.
Just the process of kind of discovery that we all experience when we're doing a big writing project, discovering that things that you thought were going to be important turn out to be less important, and vice versa, making connections.
We took a gene that was known to be involved in lung development, and we put it in a place and at a time where it isn't normally expressed, when its message isn't normally there, and asked if it could cause the formation of lung. And I was just surprised that no one else had done this experiment before, and actually really thankful no one else had done it before, because I thought it was a really good project, and it was the right time to look at it, and I was just surprised no one else had.
By the time we finished the translation, we were able to look at it not only as a whole, as its own individual work, but we were better able to kind of assess it in light of other works of the period. Everybody understands in this field the conclusions of this work. We were able finally to kind of locate it in its socio-historical context and talk about its contribution in ways that to date are actually not in print.
Probably the biggest challenge was getting people to respond to my request to contribute to the book. With non-tenured faculty, no matter how good they are, no matter where they are, you ask them if they'll contribute and they respond within a day and they say yes. So they're easy to deal with, but it's the big shots, you know, who are nearing retirement and have 70 books to their credit. They're the people who take weeks to get back to you. Almost all of them said yes, so that was terrific. I got nearly every good author I wanted But yeah, they drag their feet because they figure they're the big shots and they can let me wait.
I think the biggest challenge came after the first half of sabbatical. I had this book project about pietism, but I had a deadline for that. So even though I was removed from my usual rhythms and structures, like I had something to work towards. What was really hard was November and December, because at that point, sabbatical was all about thinking about what the next book project would be.
I had planned that I would use kind of a convenient sample with our grads and people that I knew in clinical agencies and so forth. I knew I couldn't do anything until I had formal IRB approval, but I kind of was trying to get my ducks in order. One of the things that happened then last summer was that there was a nursing strike, and that really threw kind of everybody into chaos. People that were willing were still willing, but we couldn't. We just couldn't get together. I had hoped that I would have all my interviews done by the end of summer. Well, I hadn't even started on interviews by the end of summer.
November was also, as you might remember, a tumultuous time in American politics. In some ways, it was really good to be in a part of the country that was so red state, coal country, impoverished. And I think I got a better sense of what animated that vote, but also it was very hard because I didn't have my friends, my colleagues around to help process what that election was like and the role of Christians within it. And I felt very kind of alone. And so that was really the hardest part, just kind of being away from the community I have here at Bethel.
The biggest challenge, which it turns out I was able to overcome, was visiting most of these nest sites. The sites themselves were sometimes placed on maps haphazardly, sort of close to where the actual sites were, but not pinpointed. One of the things I wanted to do was quantify land use around the sites, measure distances, like distance from the site to the nearest water, distance from the site to the nearest tall tree, etc. And I can only do those things if I know exactly where the nest sites are.
We had no guarantee. We had not gotten the copyrights for the translation. We did it basically just out of love for the work. It was originally held by the author who died, I think, in the 70s. He was a German priest, never married, didn't have any kids. We had no idea. And the publishing house was defunct. If your goal is to publish it, it is foolish because there's no guarantee. You can't publish a translation until 70 years after the author's death.
I think the biggest challenge was finding time to relax, because I had a really ambitious sabbatical project, and so I was accomplishing two pretty time-consuming projects, and it kept me really busy.
The closer we got to being finished, and the more pleased we were, the greater our anxiety that it would never get out, because we kept feeling this should get out, this should get out. The happiest day of my life, aside from getting married and having a kid, of course, is when I got the call, actually from Mike Holmes, saying that the acquisitions editor had located the guy in Germany who had the copyright. I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago, I actually signed the contract that makes it final.
I was traveling, and so being away from the family for weeks at a time, I'd go out to the lab for 1.5 to 3 weeks time. I was out there, I think, a total of about 10 weeks. So I started in the middle of January. So that was the hardest part. It wasn't really intellectual challenge, it was more from a family standpoint.
I'm an extrovert, so being away from students was the biggest challenge.
I interviewed several hospice nurses, and they understood that the skills and the knowledge that they had really made a difference in the lives of people and families that they were working with. It was just very, very heartening to hear them talk about that and realize both the dedication that they had and to even see that being able to help people was actually part of the coping skills that they used to deal with helping people.
In early April, I visited a property in Minnetonka that was somewhat out of the way, and I had contacted the person ahead of time, and we agreed to meet at a particular time. But when I got to his house, the house was shuttered and dark, and I knocked repeatedly on the door, and I finally heard a shuffling of movement inside, and I was getting pretty nervous at what I might experience at the door. The man opened the door, came outside like he probably hadn't been outside in many months. And we proceeded to have one of the most pleasant conversations about ospreys and osprey nest site selection that I've ever had. I was the one that ultimately had to break free of the conversation so that I could get about some other things.
I asked them questions about what helped them to deal with the suffering that they saw. They exercised, and some of them prayed, or they'd use meditation. There were certainly a number of people who were Christians, and yet I was actually surprised that none of them talked about their church or any kind of church group as being a source of strength for them. And in some ways that's a concern to me, because it made me wonder, if in the church, if we're really able to help people with kind of the day in, day out sort of struggles in their work setting.
The clinical internship was amazing. So I worked for 17 years in critical care units, and I've been out of the hospital now for 17 years. I knew that to just really deepen my clinical knowledge and skills and to be a better teacher for my clinical students, I needed to update myself. The thing that was so fun about it is I got to be a learner again. And I feel like I came away from it with some really neat insights, good reminders that I bring back to clinical with me now, just about your vulnerability when you're a learner.
It surprised me how much I enjoyed working for the Cub Scouts. I was the popcorn colonel for the Cub Scout popcorn sale. We raised a lot of money selling popcorn.
I also did a lot of cooking. I would look up on allrecipes.com and find a recipe, the best reviewed recipe for some dish that I wanted to make. So I made coconut cream pie, which I enjoyed, and my family did too, so that's always good. And beef stroganoff, which I really like. I can't take any credit myself. I just follow a recipe.
We homeschooled our kids during the fall simply to give us the flexibility to travel. I got to take them on nature walks. I ended up somehow being the kids' science teacher for homeschooling, and we got to take them on the Blue Ridge Parkway and to explore kind of early 20th century America and the ecology of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is so different from Minnesota.
I'm probably going to teach 5 more years, and looking for constructive things to do, whether it's volunteering or other community things, was a purpose of this sabbatical.
One of the things that I have done twice is teach the History of Science in Europe class. Some of our friends said, well, when are you going to do a History of Science class for old people? There were 9 of us that traveled to Europe for 17 days, and this was kind of our mini History of Science trip.
I also planned a conference on Sabbath, and that's going to take place over the summer. It's going to be in Santa Fe, a very small conference.
It just reinforces that I'm a goal setter. And so even on sabbatical, I needed to meet my goals, and that's just kind of who I am.
I sort of relearned that I really like asking questions and trying to find out the answers.
I've learned that I still have enough patience to do very tedious and repetitive things.
Translation work takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of focus, and you just have to sit there and work through it. It's so rich in detail, this particular text, that you can never trust that you really got it edited correctly. So you just have to go over it multiple times. So for example, we went through 251 pages of German 5 times, and then after it was all done, 3 or 4 more times. So tedious, made me want to quit scholarship.
Research is a marathon, it's not a sprint. Doing a little bit every day is good, and not getting sidetracked, keeping the goal in mind and just going towards it, knowing that you're not going to get it done in a day or a week or even in a month, but it's going to take several months, and keeping that in mind so that you keep going forward. You sort of forget that, because when you're in graduate school or doing a postdoc, it's just all you do. You're always working on research, so you're just constantly doing that, and sort of returning to a full-time research spot or time, I had to remind myself that that's how it worked.
You know, we have one semester, it goes way faster, and you think it's going to seem like plenty of time, and then it's not, and it's over so fast.
You know, we didn't get all the answers. We discovered a lot of things that gave us a lot of encouragement to keep asking questions. So what came out of Sabbatical is a good collaboration with the lab back in Cincinnati. So I'm continuing to collaborate with them, continuing the experiments that we were doing there. And I've taken some of the genes that I've been interested in on the side and also started asking questions about those.
In the past, I've been so focused on the research that I've really just immersed myself in that's all I did. But having the opportunity to travel, that's just been a real blessing.
I mean, I've always felt like a sabbatical is a gift, but when the gift is, do a dissertation, it's not exactly, it's not restful. I guess that would be the bottom line. There isn't a lot of time for contemplation and those sorts of things. Once it happens where those things are over and done with, then there's more the chance to say, what do I really want to focus on?
We had 2 grandchildren born. Each of our sons, their wives, had babies born in November and December. So they live in Chicago, we were in Chicago, and that was pretty great.
I did 2 other Europe trips this spring as well, and one was my wife and I went to Munich and Budapest.
Brian was on sabbatical in the fall too, so we went on vacation in September, which we never do that because we're teaching.
I did a solo trip. I had never traveled alone for any significant amount of time, and I found a ticket to Manchester, England. I did 2 weeks traveling around the UK and Ireland.
I had many years ago, I'd solved the Rubik's Revenge. I'd learned how to do it, but this was probably a couple decades ago. Here it is. So 4x4x4. It takes me a while to fix it because it's so much more difficult and there's so many more possible formations than there are with the regular Rubik's Cube. There is some logic involved. You have to figure out what your pattern's going to be, what you're going to do first, and what you're going to do next. The basic idea, when you put a piece in where it's supposed to be, you have to figure out what piece you're going to knock out, because that always happens. You put one in, you knock something out, and then you have to figure out how to put that piece in without knocking the first piece back out. So, but a lot of that is trial and error. It's just, common sense about how if you put one in, you're going to knock something out, and then figuring out how to arrange things so that when you put the second one back in, you don't knock something out on the other side. It's not philosophy, so, well, it's straight logic, I suppose.
Probably the greatest moments of self-discovery came on that solo trip. It's a whole different experience, and I ended up writing my thoughts down. Just being able to reflect, to have time to think about what you're doing, where you're doing it at. I learned more about where some of my true passions are. And I feel like even as an introvert, I was able to connect with people in different ways that I hadn't expected. And I think one thing I learned is that people everywhere are pretty much the same. They want a good life. They want to be happy. They want to enjoy other people. And yet having the power of choice is really important for that.
I had decided it was going to be my moment to think about where am I in my career? Now that I've reached full professor, I'm into my 40s. I picked up a book by Gary Berge from Wheaton about essentially vocation. And he talked about being in the second cohort, in the kind of mid-career professional.
I'm getting closer to retirement, so I'm not looking forward to a lot of new projects. And I've learned that I'm learning that that's difficult for me.
We were on a tour through a museum with some of our friends, and we had a tour guide. The guide made the comment that 2 essential elements to being human are a spirit of gratefulness for what we have and generosity to give to other people. And I've thought a lot about that. We hear in church, we hear in our Bethel culture about the importance of gratitude and generosity, but that has stuck with me in a new and powerful way.
It made me start thinking about the importance of tenure, which not all Christian colleges offer. And I appreciate that Bethel has this system. I mean, it's meant to foster a climate of intellectual inquiry and academic freedom. But I mean, it also can feed a sense of kind of careerism. Well, you're secure. And I think that's dangerous. And I think we kind of take it for granted. And so I wanted to think about tenure as having a responsibility then, in some ways, maybe to ask harder questions than I've asked before, to say maybe less popular things than I've said before. Because if I'm not doing that, what's the point of having this? Why not just go year to year on a contract?
I'm, at some point, going to be making a transition in terms of my own career here at Bethel. And so I also did really think that I needed to do some reading about retirement and aging and all of those kinds of things. I spent some time just trying to read and kind of rediscover maybe who I am and where I want to go. And made some lists about things that I think I don't want to do and lists of things that I do want to do.
I think especially for a Christian college, it's important that those of us who are at that point in our careers exercise that kind of role. And not just within the college, but within our church and our denominations, and to the extent we have influence with the public. I think it's important to have Christian scholars out there asking hard questions about politics, and about the media, and about race and gender. If I'm going to be at this place, and if I'm going to have the blessing of tenure, like I want to take that responsibility seriously. And so I thought a lot about that on sabbatical.
I felt a little bit guilty of taking a year-long sabbatical. My wife really convinced me to do this. She was looking forward to having more time and kind of living into our life together after all our kids are gone and when we have grandchildren. So this sabbatical is different because I wasn't looking to a big project, either at Bethel or in scholarship.
As you move into end of career kinds of things, it really does become a question of what are the things that I really would like to accomplish before I move into a different direction, whatever that might be and whenever that might be.
I loved my research project, but the clinical internship was for sure the highlight of the whole thing, because it just fed a part of me, you know, the nurse part of me, to be able to go and immerse myself in that again.
In developmental biology, my plan now is to really shift and change the lab part of what I'm doing now that I learned some new techniques, some things that I know work that I didn't know before. I plan to basically start a project-based lab in that course for the students. So they'll still do all the things and learn all the things they were learning before, but now we'll be asking questions that we don't know the answers to yet, which will be pretty cool.
I went to a conference on 18th century studies in March, and there was a digital humanities presentation from Wellesley that was really quite good. And so I have an idea for a project on mapping imaginary journeys in the 18th and early Romantic era. So it could be people like Robinson Crusoe or Pilgrim's Progress, and say Rimy the Ancient Mariner for Coleridge.
I teach a class in wildlife ecology and management. One of the things I've done is divided the class into groups. And for one of our laboratory investigations, sent these groups out to different corners of the Twin Cities and said, go find some of these nest sites. Tell students that you can use your own car, and I'm giving you a map, and I won't be looking over your shoulder. Go out and find some nests. That's just about the best thing you can tell a group of students to do, and they'll be gone before you finish your sentence.